If you have your Bibles, I ask that you would turn with me to Luke chapter 4. And we're going to be starting with verse 22 and reading through verse 30. All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Is this not Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did at Capernaum.'" And he said, "Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel at the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months. And there was a severe famine all over the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them, except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian." When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went his way. This is the word of the Lord for the people of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I have struggled a good part of my life with a fear of rejection. I remember one particular time I was in college. I was a freshman. I just started college. And I applied for an on-campus job. And the job was calling alumni, asking for money. It was a terrible job. I think I've probably told you about this before. And I was not going to be good at that job. But when I didn't get it, I was absolutely crushed. And I cried real tears. I don't think I even cared about the job, but just the fact that I had been rejected just really stung. And I can think of several other times when I felt that sting of rejection for one reason or another. Think about the time in high school when I wasn't invited to the sleepover with all of my friends from church. Or the time when I didn't win the student body election in college. Or the time that I wasn't picked to attend an event, a conference, because of my gender. Never felt good. And I let all of them affect me way more than I should have. And I think that I've struggled so much with that rejection because I desperately want people to like me. I have become, and that fear of rejection has made me be a people pleaser at times. It has made me do and say things that maybe I didn't actually believe or wouldn't have actually said on my own. And it has made me think a lot more about what I can do to make people like me than I should. I was thinking about people who had experienced rejection but didn't let it affect them, and I thought of quite a few names that maybe you've heard of. People like Jackie Robinson and Thomas Edison and Oprah Winfrey, Steve Jobs, Vincent van Gogh. All of them experienced some form of rejection in their lifetime, and yet you all still know their names because they didn't allow that rejection to define them. As I have grown, I have realized that rejection is inevitable. Jesus himself faced it, and his response teaches us how to move forward. This morning in our Luke passage, we get the follow-up from last week's story. Jesus had just read the passage in the temple from Isaiah with some really good news for people who needed really good news. And now we get the reaction of those in the temple. At first, they marvel. They're really impressed with his words. And then Jesus tells them that he has not come for them. And they get angry. And they drive him to the edge of town with the intention of hurling him off a cliff. Those are some big, strong emotions, right? And really fast, they get there. His response, though, to that is just why I really love this story. it says in Luke that he passed through their midst and went his way. Jesus was so unbothered by their rejection. It didn't stop him from doing what he came to do. He didn't spend the next 3 days holed up in his house crying because they didn't like him. He didn't let them drive him off the cliff. He just walked away and continued his work. The truth is that sometimes God's call leads to being rejected. But that doesn't change his call. That doesn't change his purpose for us. We have to decide how we will respond to that rejection. Will we shrink back? Or will we continue on our way? So this morning I want us to take just a little bit of a deeper look at this passage. And the first thing is that I want to talk about is the offensive truth. You see, Jesus is aware that the people in the room are only concerned with how Jesus can make their life better. They aren't interested in what he really has to offer. They are interested in the mission that he has come to fulfill. The truth is that he has come to reach those who don't yet know. And he's already aware that for the most part, he will not be accepted by his own people. He tells them that a prophet cannot be accepted in their own hometown while he's in his own hometown. And then he gives them a couple examples from the Old Testament of times when God pursued non-believers. I just read both of these stories that he mentions in the last couple of weeks in my journey through reading the Bible. And the first story was about Elijah and a certain widow. And it was in a time of drought and famine, and there were a lot of widows among God's people. But God designated one person, a non-believer, someone who wasn't in the circle of the family of God, to make known his presence and power. And he sends Elijah to her and tells him to ask her for a little bit of water and some bread. Now remember, it was a drought and a famine, which means those are two very precious things. And Elijah meets her and he says, hey, can you make me a little bit of bread? Can you spare a little bit of water? And she says, I only have this small amount of flour and just a little bit of oil. My plan was to go home and mix it up and make a small cake of bread for me and my son, and then we would die. And Elijah tells her, just go, and if you can do it, go make me a little bit of bread, and then make some for you and your son. And he says, and your resources will not dry up. And it happened. Every time she went to make bread, there was flour and a little bit of oil, and there was enough for her to bake. Every time she'd go back, there was enough for them to eat. And so they didn't starve and they didn't die. And from this, she knew that Elijah was surely a man of God. And then later, in this story, just right away, it tells us that her son did die. We don't know what from, but he died and he was laying in the bed. And she goes to Elijah because she knows he's a man of God. And she says, can you help me? And he goes and he lays himself over the son and he speaks this life into him, and he's raised from the dead. And this kind of sealed the deal for her. And she declared that not only was Elijah a man of God, but he spoke truth. He was trustworthy. And then Jesus reminded them of the story of Elisha and Naaman. Naaman had leprosy. He was the commander of the army of Syria. And he had this servant girl who was from Israel. And she had known about Elisha, the man of God. And she told him, Naaman had this leprosy all over his skin. And he couldn't be around people. And it was painful, I'm sure. And so she said, well, why don't you go to the king in Israel and tell him that you want the man of God to help you. And the king's like, what can I do? Go to him yourself. And so the servant goes to Elisha and he says, just tell him to go wash himself in the Jordan 7 times. And he was kind of annoyed by that answer. He was like, don't you think I've already tried washing it off? Like, it's not coming off, man. And his servant said, hey, if he told you to do something really hard, you would do it, right? And he was like, well, of course. And he's like, why don't you just try this simple thing then and see what happens? Like, what could it hurt? And so he goes to the Jordan, and he washes himself 7 times, and immediately it says that his skin was cleansed. But it didn't just say his skin was cleansed. It said that he had the skin of like a new baby. He had, it wasn't old man, army general skin. It was like fresh, beautiful skin. And he went back to Elisha, and he declared that he knew that there was a God. Sorry. He knew that there was no God but the God of Israel. Did this just go out? Sure did. Jesus reminds the people that while there were a lot of people in Israel who were experiencing heartache and famine and disease, God sent his prophets to these strangers. And through that, God was glorified. These would have been stories that they all knew really well in that temple. By this time, Elijah and Elisha, they were respected prophets. They had read their accounts from the Torah in the synagogue. They knew their stories, and they knew them and believed them to be true. But they had become offensive to them in this instance because Jesus was telling them that he had not come for them. God had sent him for another. And there are times when our truth is also offensive to those outside of the world, those in the outside world. The things that God has called us to, the mission that he has given us, does not align with that of the world. We are not called to political power and prestige or our own glory. And that does not make sense to the rest of the world. The things that we know to be true offend those who do not yet understand. But that doesn't mean that we don't share the truth. That doesn't mean that we don't stick to what we know is true. Jesus shared the truth because he loved people. Because he had been sent to bring them transformation and regeneration. And we share the truth because we want that for the world as well. We do not share the truth because we want to make people know that we are right and they are wrong. We don't share the truth because we want to build up walls around us that keep others out. We do it because it is what Jesus did. The second thing this morning from this passage that I want to talk about is the journey from rejection to rage. When Jesus shared the truth with the crowd, they quickly moved from admiration to anger. The good news that Jesus came to share can also be infuriating news to those who are not prepared to hear it. The good news that Jesus came to preach was not the good news that they wanted to hear. James Bryan Smith talks about this in his book, The Good and Beautiful Life, in the chapter about anger, and he says that anger is the result of unmet expectations. When you think of every time you have ever been really angry at someone, you can likely trace it back to what you expected from a person and see that your anger was fueled when that expectation was not met. Whether it was an expectation you had of your child to, I don't know, maybe behave in church, or maybe it was an expectation you had of your spouse to take care of you, or an expectation that your job would not treat you with disrespect. Whatever that expectation was, when it was not met, the result is often anger. And when you look at our world right now, you can see that many of us, we have expectations of the world. We expect our government to take care of its people. We expect families to be safe. We expect to be able to afford groceries. We expect our leaders to act with compassion. And maybe we even expect everyone around us to agree with us. And when those things are challenged, we get angry. The crowd from the temple got so angry that they drove Jesus up a hill to the edge of a cliff. They went from temple worshipers to attempted murderers in mere moments as a result of their anger. And I see that happen among the people of God often. We worship God on Sundays, and then we rip apart our coworkers and family and friends on Sunday afternoon. We move from people of God to raging lunatics in mere moments. Like the crowd in the temple, we often become enraged when God doesn't act the way that we expect. And the question is, will we trust him even when his ways challenge us? Will we let our rage, our unmet expectations, fuel us to treat each other with unkindness? Or will we allow God to change our hearts and minds in a way that changes our expectations? The last thing this morning is that God's purpose is ours to share. The truth is that God's purpose is not dependent on the circumstances around us. Amen. It's not dependent on whether people like us or whether people agree with us. God's purpose is unchanging. The crowd was angry that Jesus had the audacity to sit among them and claim that they would not be the vessels for the unfolding of God's new narrative. And so the insider became the outsider. And this was the beginning of a new narrative. A narrative that said that the good news, the redemptive work of God, was not just for the Jew, but also for the Gentile. This is God at work, just as he has been at work across the ages, as God is at work even now, unfolding new narratives with, through, and among those who are often seen as outsiders. The church is seeing God write new narratives even now among us. And maybe his new narrative is not for those inside of the walls of the church. In fact, if we believe the New Testament to be true, then we can guess that maybe it definitely is not for us. It's for those who are outside of the walls of the church. Maybe if we're going to reach the hurting and the lost outside of the church, we'll have to be willing to go to the edges, to go to the outsiders. Maybe we'll have to go to the struggling widows, the dying children, the places of famine and disease, and bear witness to God through his actions in those places. The God we proclaim and worship will not be tamed, homebound, shut in, or confined by our temples. God does not quietly accept our well-worn narratives, our how it's supposed to be, our complacency and comfort. Jesus comes into our midst and declares that the scriptures have been fulfilled in him, through him. And then he goes not to create a new narrative that is ours to follow and recreate. New narratives are unfolding in our midst, in some of the most peculiar places, where God continues to act far outside of our holy walls. And we have to decide if we will join him in his mission, his unchanging mission, or if we will be the ones pushing him to the edge of the cliff. God's going to continue to do his work in the world, whether we are a part of it at all. But we can be a part of it. So the question this morning is, will we join his mission? Or will we watch him walk through our midst and continue on his way? I'm getting a little better at handling rejection. Still working on it, but getting a little better. When I look at Jesus' response to the crowd, I don't see him begging for approval or wallowing in self-doubt. I see him walking forward, unshaken, because he knew his mission. And that's the example that I want to follow. I want to be so rooted in God's calling that rejection doesn't derail me. So what about you? Are you holding back something that God has called you to because you're afraid of what others might think? Are you letting fear of rejection keep you from faithfulness? Jesus shows us a better way. He calls us to keep walking, to stay faithful, and to trust that God's purpose will prevail, even when the world pushes back. So today, let's choose faithfulness over fear. Let's step boldly into the work God has placed before us, knowing that his mission will go forward with or without us. Will you be a part of it?